Fairly long story. I was born in Rochdale. On the River Roach, because the Rochdale, a tributary of the Irwell, as that a well-known polluted river. I fished as a youngster on mill lodges, catching goldfish that had grown in the warm water of the lodges. And then it was grammar school and no more fishing. And I started work very early at 17 to run the family business when my father was taken ill. And it was quite hectic at the time. But I moved to a house that was on the top of the roach of the valley of the River Roach. And it was a beautiful looking river, but it was just full of sewage fungus. And I always remember going to see a counsellor about this. And this was my first escapade into looking at water quality. And I said, look, the sewage works just isn't doing its job here. And it needs a complete upgrade and to stop all this pollution going into the river. And he just turned around to me and he said, hey lad, there's no votes in sewage. End of conversation. And that was the attitude of local authorities, many local authorities, when they were in private ownership. It is only really the privatisation of water that's allowed us to get on top of that problem. I'm Philip Lord and I'm chairman of the Trust. A friend of mine persuaded me to start fishing again, perhaps when I was 23 or 4. And they took me out to several rivers and I caught a salmon or two, so that really did it. And then a gentleman I'd known for a long time said, I believe you're fishing, Philip. I said, yes. And he said, would you like to become a member of the Hodder Fishing Club? And I said, oh yes, please. And the consequence of that is eventually, 42 years ago actually, I bought a house in the Hodder Valley and come to live here. Now, in fishing this river, I also started to witness other things, particularly at Calder Foot. That's the pool where the River Calder meets the Ribble. And there were persistently, in certain conditions, very big fish kills there from pollution. And what it was sewage that built up in the river, and then a sudden damp, or normally a thunderstorm, would put up the Calder and it would be up before the Ribble ever got up, and it would just wash out all the sewage straight into the Ribble, and there were the fish and they all died. And it was a pretty frequent happening, this, and it was decimating the river. So I was then asked to become the secretary of the Ribble Consultative, a body that is still going. And it was that really that fired me into trying to do something about the position of these rivers, and ever since I've been deeply involved in it. As a secretary of the consultative, the agency came to me and said, we'd like to talk to you about some possible funding to do some environmental work on the river. So we're obviously interested, and a small group of us, 5 of us I think, got together with the agency, and literally there was a possible £5 million looking at us. And the agency appointed a consultant to actually draw up the documentation and everything. And for 2 years we worked on this. And at the latter time, just before it was submitted, they said, look, we're going to submit it under a name, and we really think, this is the agency speaking, that there should be a trust to do this. And we agreed. And we saw the solicitors, drew up documentation and formed the trust. And then there's a question of who would do what. And nobody would stand up until the agency said to me, "Philip, you're going to have to do it." So they're responsible, really, for me being here. They might have regretted it sometimes, though. We didn't get the grant, no. It all went to the farmers for doing work on the farms, which to some degree or other was a waste of money from as far as the river was concerned. But they then looked at us and said, "Look, there's another fund here. Put a bid in for a specific project." And we drew one up to work on Skirden, and we got £100,000 out of it. And that was the start of it. Now, we employed nobody. We were all volunteers. And so we started to do the work, either do it ourselves, or on many occasions we'd have to bring in the contractor to do certain types of work. And so that's how it ran. And it went on like that for a few years, and we were getting busier and busier, really. Alan Roundtree, our treasurer, came in right at the beginning as well. And without Alan, it would have been difficult because he kept all the finances very straight and in proper order, which has stood us in good stead over many years. From there, we decided we ought to have somebody, and we were working with one of the funding bodies, and there was a man there who I thought could be quite helpful. And he did start with it. He started first of all part-time, then full-time. And then I got involved with the Rivers Trust. The Rivers Trust is the umbrella body for all river trusts. So there are now 50 odd of them in England and Wales. And a gentleman there said to me, "Philip, you're doing fine." He said, "But I really think you need the scientists." It was from then on that we took the plunge and advertised. And the result is that Jack Spees came, and Jack is still with us, and he is now the chief executive of the trust. The river was eroding badly and getting wide. This is the Skirden Beck in particular. So we attempted to restrict it to some degree or other. It was a very good spawning stream for salmon and sea trout, and it's got two substantial tributaries coming into it. In fact, it's one of the bigger small tributaries. And so really we were looking after everything we could in that area, talking to the farmers, and so that was it. And it was a success, but what I didn't realise is the sheer power of that stream. Because in practice, some of the revetment work we did on banks and things was swept away in big floods. And we learnt lessons, shall we say, there. And it's another reason, really, for wanting professional staff. The first thing that Jack did was to survey the whole river. And he came up with the astonishing figure of over 1,000 obstructions of various sizes and types within the Ribble and its tributaries. And many of these were stopping migration, and therefore the fish weren't spreading out. They weren't going over what was should be their natural habitat, because a lot of these structures date back to the early Industrial Revolution, and then some for farming, and all sorts of reasons. But so one of the things, we started to remove these, and we removed very many of them now, but we still have some more to go, of course. It then became obvious, when you we thought about it, that everything that we were trying to do really came back to people. People had caused the changes in the river. The population was expanding, the Industrial Revolution grew very fast, And then in Victorian eras, was tremendously important to the economy. Now, an example of this is, since then, we have done a major scheme in Burnley. And Burnley, the river had been, through the town centre, been completely, two rivers there are there, the Brun and the Calder, had been transformed. And what they'd done, they'd made it into a cobbled riverbed, which was two slight sloping cobble sets, perhaps 5 or 6 feet wide and just above the natural level. But in the middle was a deep, narrow channel. And the reason for this is that, once again, that word sewage. The sewage was being pumped straight into the river, neat. And when the river was spread out on its natural way, it would have slow and fast areas, and it was settling out, and in hot weather, the stench was unbearable. So it was the Victorian answer to their problem in Burnley was, get this channel, and every time there's some wood, it'll wash it all off downstream. Lovely for Burnley, but nobody else. And it showed you what happens with priorities with people. It was make money, textiles, engineering, and just stick it in the river. The best thing I think that's happened to rivers of this country was Margaret Thatcher's privatisation of water, because it's allowed the water companies then to make a proper charge for water services and sewage services, and then put capital into all the treatment works. They're still doing more, they've still got more to do, because it is a massive job. It couldn't be done any other way. Trees, first of all, provide cover over the river. They lean out over the river, and they provide shade, and that helps a lot of wild creatures. I mean, the birds love them, obviously, and everything in the river likes them because they can get into a shelter place, but particularly in summer. The trees in the shade, if you get an avenue of trees on the riverbank and in shade, the water will be 3, possibly 4 degrees cooler than the adjoining water on a hot day. And temperature controls the amount of oxygen in the water, and so if it goes higher, we'll have less oxygen, and the creatures in the river start to suffer for it and can die. So that's really it. And it just helps the whole river corridor to be used by all wildlife, because you've got a mixed environment there, and it's as simple as that, really. We're stood here on the banks of the Hodder, and one bank is completely treed in, mature deciduous trees, and the other bank is partly treed, and it's delightful. And it's a habitat that's perfect for all wildlife, really. The otters come up here, a lot of bird life on the river itself, and of course the fish come as well. And the fish really are our best measurement of how successful a river is. If we can track fish, we can check on how successful their spawning has been and how far they've got and what areas are the best for them. And it's that keeps the whole river alive. It's the fly life in the river is the bottom of the food chain, and it shows how important it is. So the consequence of that now, of course, is we're doing a lot more work working with farmers. Now, I've lived in the valley for 42 years, and when we came, the farmer would have a small tractor, and that would be it. And he could cut grass and make hay. But now, the size of the traffic the farms use now, the scale of it is huge. They can hardly get down the roads when they're harvesting, and there's a whole change gone, and the farming has become quite a serious business. And from small farms, we've now got quite a few large farms from amalgamations, and we're now working with the farmers to see how we can reduce the amount of feces from the stock coming in. And a lot of farmers are very good and help us, but not all. But it just goes back to what I said earlier. It's people. Everything we think about is people, what people do. And of course, in the news at the moment, very much so, is this question of plastics. And we've been conscious of this on a small scale in the rivers, and we've had clean-ups on riverbanks when we're taking massive amount of rubbish out of the rivers, and a lot of that is plastic. I think one of the most important things we're doing now is working with schools and education. And I think we find the children take the message home, and I think they like it. They feel it's the right thing to be doing. And if we can get everybody thinking like that, and of course if you watch television recently on plastics, you'll see that they've got a campaign going through, which is great. I think it's one of the best things they've ever done, and showing up with the problems. And it's been on the radio today, actually. This morning I was listening to it. And the more people we convert to either not using plastics or being careful what they do with it, or recycling if it is recyclable. There are many, many problems. It is a huge problem, but it's just symptomatic of what people do. We have got to live with nature, I think. We've been very successful, and Jack in particular has been very successful in raising a lot good-sized capital for major projects, from lottery, sometimes from the agency, from the water company. We've had help from a lot of quarters really on that, and from other environmental charities. So it's not like I've run a business all my life, and cash flow is how you've got to run the business. You've got to control of it. And when we're raising money on a voluntary basis, it's not quite the same thing. Industry produces goods, sells something, makes a profit, and then reinvest some of that. And we can't make a profit. And so we've got to keep asking and asking for money. And it's hard. I think we do better on actual projects, so be it removing a huge weir or something, or that sort of thing, and sometimes for planting trees, but it doesn't look after the ancillary costs of running the trust and things like that. So it is that pressure on the trust continually to have to raise money. Education, for example, we currently got 3 years funding for our work on education. Now, it's absolutely essential. It's essential to the rivers, it's essential to the population, it's essential to wildlife to keep that going. Now, we can't keep going to the same place and asking for the same amount every 2 or 3 years. So we've got to create a method of producing a regular income to pay for our staff that are doing this work with schools. The schools are readily take what we're offering, but they've had their budgets cut, so we don't seem to be able to get much out of them. But we want to do it, and we have to succeed in this. The Burnley job I described to you, and at the end of that job, when we were just opening up the channels after the work had been done, the first thing that happened is a sea trout appeared. Now, there haven't been sea trout in Burnley for 150 years. But like all nature, if there's a void and it's suddenly available to them, they come into it. And there's a 4-pound fish there, was actually caught by the contractors, filmed and put back into the river. And then after the next winter, our staff were monitoring the fry in the river, and sure enough, we had salmon. We had salmon that had gone above Burnley and successfully spawned, and there were young salmon in the river. Now,
That, again, as I said, it is the fish that measure the river and tell us how good it is. So that was a real feeling of success. When we moved to the valley, I still continued to work in Rochdale for the next 25 years and drove there every day. But my wife had always been a gardener, and we got quite an area of land with this. Well, it was a barn, it's now a house. And I became very interested in gardening, and particularly aspect of it was trees and large shrubs. And I started to collect trees, and I can go into the garden now, which is now in my daughter's ownership, and I can look at trees that I planted 30 and 40 years ago, and they're 70 or 80 feet high. And some of them are trees that are from other climes, from South America, from the Himalayas, and it has a lovely sense of peace in the garden with the trees, and a small stream running through it in which the sea trout spawn. And I didn't even know that for several years until one day, going down the stream, I saw a dead sea trout. Oh, I thought, that's interesting. I now know why the heron comes every autumn into the garden. And I should have realised that before. But sea trout come up at night. It's only a very small beck. You can walk across it in your shoes. And they come up on the flood, and they'll spawn that night. But they know if the river's going stale, they actually stay for several days, and then you can find them in daylight. And one day, I saw this fish spawning, and I rang up a friend of mine who's also a trustee of the trust. I said, come up here quick. And we lay down and peered over a bank, and there was a fish there. And don't forget, this stream is about 3 foot wide at the most, and only a few inches deep. And it was busy digging into the gravel. And it was about 6 pounds, and I'd never seen a fish of this size in such a small stream. But what it taught me is how far the sea trout will go. It can't go much further than the garden because there's a big waterfall at the top of it. And it's so important to look after every little bit of water. So I got a lot of satisfaction really out of both gardening and seeing that. I would like to see everybody taking care of the whole environment, instilling it into everybody. That I don't think the world will be the same place without a wild environment somewhere. And we're lucky in this country that we have the possibilities of it with our rivers. And I just like to see it as near to nature as you could possibly get without the interference of man. And that, I think, would be very satisfying. Unfortunately, I shan't be here in 20 years' time, but perhaps looking down, I might be able to see it.